So I have to tell you that I'm just thrilled so many people are here today who can contribute to the conversation and are really committed to making change, because the point about women in engineering for me is particularly poignant as we're approaching the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre. And as some of you know, I've been working on issues around women in technology for 30 years. And there are fewer women in computer science today, and only marginally more in engineering than there were 30 years ago. So it's clear that what we're doing is not working, and that's part of the reason why, the focus of my talk is really trying to have a much more intentional discussion on driving systems change, because all of the good intentions and the rainbow posters and the astronauts talking to schoolgirls are not producing the results that we want when it comes to gender, and ditto when it comes to Indigenous people, racialized people, people with disabilities, and so on. I want to provide a little bit of a background and a context and share with you the framework that we use at the Diversity Institute, whether it's for our work on women in leadership, whether it's our work in women in entrepreneurship, whether it's our work on future skills and inclusion. That's the ecological model. And I also want to share some conclusions, and I'm hoping that this will help frame the discussion for the next 2 days, and also help you understand why we picked some of the things that we picked. Because what we're really interested in trying to do is mapping systems and understanding where the levers are that will really produce change. So I'm not going to talk more about the Diversity Institute other than to say we're in the Ted Rogers School of Business Management. And the reason that's important is because we come to this issue with a deep commitment, obviously, to equity and human rights, but our focus is very much on what is now called the business case, although some people don't like that language, meaning that we're very much preoccupied with the economic lens being applied to this issue, how we can drive, for example, diversity in the workplace, advance diversity in leadership, and diversity and inclusion in entrepreneurship. And all of you have probably seen this graphic, which tries to very quickly explain the differences between equality, equity, and liberation or inclusion. And one of my staff sent me this as a counterpoint to just make sure that we keep it real. And one of the real advantages with the Diversity Institute and our Future Skills Network of researchers and, in fact, the very diverse network of partners that we have is we are forced to keep it real, because we're working with people who live these things every day. So we tend to focus on the employment equity designated groups in a lot of our research, which doesn't mean that we don't care about other groups. So we have done research at as granular a level as looking at Black homeless youth. We've looked at Muslim women in the workplace, and so on. And certainly we also look at issues. We looked at Black homeless LGBTQ2+ youth. We looked at Somali people. We've looked at very small segments of these different populations, but a lot of our work does focus on the big employment equity groups, and we're very much attentive to intersectionality. As I said, a lot of our work is grounded in the business case. You can call it what you want. It's the notion that diversity and inclusion are important for achieving. Abby, come sit up at the front. They'll make a path for you. You would have loved Rachel's presentation. Which is, as Rachel mentioned, the lens in terms of looking at the future of work and the skills gap. We know that all employment growth is going to come through immigration because we don't have enough people to fill the jobs. Looking at issues around driving innovation, one of my big areas of focus, improving organizational performance. We know that organizations that get this right have happier, more productive employees. And certainly we also know that if you get it wrong, there are real consequences. The things, and Rachel talked about some of these issues. So the big, I guess, paradox that really drives our focus is, on the one hand, and I've been in the biz for long enough that I remember, you know, the late 1980s when John Roth, who was the CEO of Northern Telecom, was talking about the skills gap, how we needed more computer scientists and engineers. We hear the constant, I was going to say bleating, but that would be pejorative. The constant cries of industry, large and small, about how they can't find qualified workers. But the paradox is, we also know that there are engineers and computer scientists working as security guards and driving cab. We know that women are underemployed. We know, and I'll show you the data, but one of the most horrifying things for me is that university graduates with a severe disability have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts without a disability. So there is this paradox where, on the one hand, employers are saying we need skilled talent, and on the other hand, we know there are people with skills that are being underutilized. And that's really the thing that drives us. We also know that Indigenous youth are the fastest growing segment of the population. And with respect to Rachel, I have been working in the trenches on advancing women in engineering for 30 years, so I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that completely. But I do think that the overemphasis of science, technology, and engineering and math, and everything from research to innovation to entrepreneurship, excludes people. And we have to have a balance. So in addition to promoting more women in engineering, we have to also think about redefining what digital skills are, what skills are that are needed. Stop talking about the soft skills, because the soft skills are actually hard. So we have to recognize that you can embed certain systemic conceptions, like STEM is the most important thing in the world, and that has consequences for people who are doing important work as well. And our work, you know, Diversity Leads, this was part of what really pushed me to think about intersectionality, because we are seeing progress with respect to gender. This was a study that looked at leadership defined as members of boards of directors, as well as C-suite executives across sectors. And we've been doing this work since 2009 and tracking changes. So here's the data for the GTA. We know that in the GTA, half the population is women, half the workers are women. And women are now achieving close to parity in things like government appointments to ABCs in the education sector, the voluntary sector, and so on. So, and certainly the public sector as well as elected office, they're hitting about 40%, but the corporate sector remains far behind at 25%. So that is certainly a project we need to work on. But the other thing that for me is really important to note is that in the GTA, for every white person, there is a racialized person. They're 50% of the population, same as women, right? And yet look at the levels of representation of racialized people in leadership roles. You know, in the corporate sector, where they represent 50% of the workers, they're 7.2% of leaders. And when we take an intersectional lens, what we find in the corporate sector is that racialized women are outnumbered by white women by a factor of 17 to 1. In a population where the ratio is 1 to 1. So we have to have an intersectional lens. And if we're also doing work looking at LGBTQ2+, we're looking at Indigenous women, we're looking at women with disabilities. Ruby's nodding her head because she's done all the interviews. The data is so little, they're rounding errors. So we have to do qualitative research to try to figure out what's going on because they're pretty much absent, or in some cases passing and concealing their identity because of the intense bias. So this is something that is critically important. It really reinforces what Rachel already talked about. And Montreal is worse. Montreal's better for women, but in Montreal, in the greater Montreal area, racialized minorities, 20% of the population, 2% of corporate leaders, 2%. So work to be done. And the other thing, you know, why this research for us is really important is because we can look within sectors and we can look at data points like 14% of boards have at least 40% women, okay? And 6% had none in Montreal. That's pretty good because across Canada, over 30% of boards have none. If you see a substantial proportion of boards at 40% women and others at none, we call those corporate zeros. What that tells you is it is not the pool of talent, it's the processes. When you see those kinds of variances, and we've done this kind of analysis across sectors. So, you know, in the GTA, 24% of boards had 30% women in 2017, 28% had none. Not the pool. Processes, intentional targets and strategies, and a commitment to driving change. I already talked, this is my most horrifying slide, which shows that university graduates with severe disabilities have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts. And this is something obviously we have to work at. We know that Indigenous people are severely underemployed relative to their representation in the population. And it's part of the reason why we've come up with this ecological model, which tries to tackle the whole problem of change through a systems lens. And so, you know, as people in the audience have already noted, some of the problems are deeply embedded in our structures, in our culture, in our notions of what a leader is, in our notion of what an entrepreneur is, in our notions of where women belong and don't belong. And we really have to recognize the importance of values and culture at the macro level, as well as policies, as well as socioeconomic trends, and so on. In our panel at lunch, I'm so excited to have the panel of trailblazers who are going to talk about legislation and how important legislation is, because it not only reflects values, but it shapes them. So the work that Rachel and her colleagues do in terms of policy legislation, without a doubt, critically important to shaping the world. At the same time, organizations develop policies and practices, and we've seen those can have a profound effect. And at the end of the day, individuals make choices, and those choices have probably the most impact on what people aspire to, how people are treated, and who is given opportunities. And we were inspired by some of the systems theory around other, you know, wicked problems. Obesity is my favorite because it's kind of one of my wicked problems. And it's the reason it's important is it really underscores the fact that knowledge doesn't drive change. Education is one of the least effective ways to drive change. I know if I eat too much and don't exercise, I'd be fat, but it doesn't have any impact on what I do or I don't do. And there's a lot of evidence, whether we're looking at smoking, whether we're looking at motor vehicle crashes, or whether we're looking at diversity and inclusion, that we have to really be intentional about the levers. And if you look at public health literature, engineering, for example, speed bumps and airbags, way more impactful on saving lives than telling people not to speed. Enforcement, having laws that are actually enforced, rules like Bill C-25, which I'll talk about, have a real impact on what people do and don't do. Economic incentives, also very important. So education, I'm not saying that we shouldn't work on raising awareness and sharing best practices and so on, but that is not the most effective way to drive change. And when we look at diversity and inclusion, one of the best examples I like to cite is Legal Leaders for Diversity. Any lawyers in the room? Yes. Legal Leaders for Diversity was corporate counsels at big firms. So the lawyers who work at KPMG or RBC or the big organizations got together and said, we are going to use a diversity and inclusion lens when we make decisions about what law firms to hire and who we're going to give our business to. Bay Street law firms moved faster in response to that than they did to years and years of, we should create inclusion, and isn't it shocking that women are leaving the firms? So, for me, I'm really interested in behavioral economics and levers that will really drive change, and maybe they will find ways to cure obesity as well. So I mentioned this already. Really, we're interested at societal level issues. We're really preoccupied with how we change stereotypes around who experts are and who leaders are, because if you can't see it, you can't be it. And if the people that you see every night telling you the truth and making decisions for you don't look like you, that has a big impact. This is fairly disgusting, and it's only a couple of years old. And yet, on the other hand, we have narratives that get reinforced. So these are CEOs of the largest ICT firms in the US who are women, a country where there are more CEOs named James, where there are women. But only half of them came out of STEM backgrounds. And Denise is shaking her head. She's the VP at the Information Technology Association of Canada, and we've been fighting this battle for a number of years. So thinking about, if you want women in technology, there are multiple pathways. Abby will be talking, for example, about opportunities in user experience and design and areas where we can get women into high-paid tech jobs without them necessarily taking the engineering path. We have to push alternative narratives. This is one of my favorites is the Forbes, ADHD, the entrepreneur's superpower. Some of the work that's being undertaken now around cognitive difference and how you can treat that as an asset rather than a liability. Thinking about the fact that immigrants drive entrepreneurship, that more than half of the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were newcomers and so on. And we're doing some work right now looking at diversity and inclusion in advertising and some of the disruptive images that can help change stereotypes. That's a Mercedes. In the bottom right corner, that's a Mercedes ad. Mercedes makes cars and wheelchairs. And of course, one of our proudest moments was Bill C-25, an act to amend the Canadian Corporations Act, because, and Ruby was intimately involved in this, as were many people around the room. Originally, that legislation was going to replicate Ontario's Security Commission legislation, which defined diversity as gender and required corporations that were federally regulated, or not federally regulated, those are the employment equity companies. 55% of corporations are federally incorporated, and it was going to require them to report on gender and report on their strategy to address targets. And we went in with our evidence and said, it's not good enough. Not good enough in the 21st century. So we were able to get them to change the definition of diversity to include the employment equity categories. Not great, not the best, not complete, but we were able to say banks have been doing this for 40 years. Really? You're saying it's too big a stretch. So pushing that kind of change at the macro level, we do think is very impactful. And at the organizational level, we've been doing a lot of work in identifying leading practices. Tone at the top, absolutely critical. HR practices, very, very important, and there are lots of people in the room who specialize in this, and we'll talk more about those. Using new innovative tools and technologies to offset unconscious bias to make processes fairer, whether we're talking about the assessment of skills, the measurement of skills, or the development of skills. Thinking about the quality of life and culture. I do view work as an extreme sport, but I recognize that things are changing, and even in consulting firms, there's more focus on work-life balance because people recognize that that talent is the scarcest resource. And more accountability. You know, what gets measured gets done. But our secret weapon, I think, is our focus on diversity and inclusion through the value chain, looking at how you link diversity and inclusion to every step of your corporate practices, starting with procurement, looking at your marketing, looking at your research and development, and Rachel gave some really good examples of why that's important, looking at your outreach, looking at your customer support, and looking at how you use the levers in your organization that are at your disposal to drive change at the macro level, as well as shifting attitudes and behaviors. And this includes everything from the No More Manels movement, where organizations are just saying we will not sponsor or participate in panels that are only men, and I would extend that with a diversity lens, to the kind of outreach that we're doing in schools. At the end of the day, it's individual decisions. And I mean, I think the biggest impediment, frankly, to progressive change is actually not that it's too hard, not that people don't care, not that people aren't committed, but bystanderism. I bet every single person in this room has observed an incident or a situation that you thought was off, was wrong, but often it's very hard to do anything about it. And that's something we really have to change. I think the Me Too movement has had some impact in that regard, but we have to create environments where people are prepared to call these things out. And there's lots of stuff like the implicit bias stuff. So, you know, from my perspective, this is a competitive issue. This is not just a human rights and equity issue. It's more than an HR issue. We have to really think about it as strategy, and the whole of government approach that Canada is now taking, gender-based budgeting, the Gender Plus lens they're applying to everything from their procurement practices to policies and economic development, hugely important. And really trying to focus our research and our understanding on what works and what doesn't work, whether we're talking about future skills, whether we're talking about women entrepreneurship, whether we're talking about driving diversity and inclusion. And many of you have seen this before, but I actually think that this would be a great Brand Canada poster. This is a poster that Lakeridge Community Healthcare Centre developed during the last election, not the one just gone by, but the one before, at the same time that Quebec was having the debate about the niqab, and there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And I think it bears constant repeating that we don't care what's on your head, we care what's in it. And if Canada is successful in implementing this, we will have the opportunity to attract and retain the best and the brightest from around the world, and that's key to both our economic and social development. Thank you very much.